So when I was in dental school, I was kind of in that transition group. We were still using a lot of amalgam, and we weren't really taught how to adequately prepare and place posterior composites. And nowadays at my practice, that's almost exclusively what I'm doing is bonding posterior composite restoration. So there's a couple lessons that you learn along the way, problems you have, and things that you realize nobody really told you about. They told you about the basics, but really the nitty-gritty things that impact your success long-term come from trial and error and from learning from mentors. So I'm going to pass on a couple little tips, and I'm going to talk about 4 main areas that have really helped me with my posterior composite bonding, my posterior restoration. So number 1 is the band and wedge placement. So I use the V-ring system, and it's got one of the little sectional matrices. And one thing you notice when you start using those is you place them, and ideally they go in perfect, and you put your band in and your wedge in, and your contact is perfectly closed. But that's not really how it works most of the time for me. So what happens is you put your band down, and occasionally you get a little gap here between your margin of your restoration and the band. And that's the reason for the wedge. So you place your wedge, but sometimes, even if you use a really large wedge, you still are going to have a little space where you'll notice there's a little give in the area where the band meets the margin. And that gets to be a little tricky because you're going to have an overhang. So what you need to do is make sure that band is pulled tight against the tooth. Sometimes I use a little explorer to go down, push it against, place my wedge, and then when you place the clamp, you really need to make sure it's tight and snug against the tooth. Sometimes you can place the clamp and it will have a little bend or wedge in the band itself, which creates another gap. So important during placement of your band is to make sure A, it's tight against the tooth, B, you have an adequate size wedge. Sometimes it's tricky because you're in that middle ground where the interproximal area isn't big enough to get a bigger wedge in. So you may have to tighten your band, hold it, place your clamp, and then the other part is once it's placed, once it's snug against that margin, in order to get your contact area adequately formed anatomically, you actually somewhat, I'll call it burnish, but you need to make sure you kind of push that band area back up against the opposing tooth. I'll actually use like a little plugger or condenser that's used for amalgam. So after I place my band, my wedge, the clamp, I'll go in with a little condenser and actually push and shape that box. And that just extends, if we're looking down on the teeth, that actually allows me to get that wedge shaped kind of like this, to get this broader contact area. So use that. That's a great way to help shape the contact. 3, what you notice too, because you do a layer technique with your composite packable material, what you're going to want to do is, I've learned a great technique, and that's lining the margin with a great high quality flowable composite. Not a lot, but just enough, because when you do bulk fill or you do a packable lined layering of composite, what you notice is sometimes as good as you try to pack that material and place that material, when you pull your wedge, you're going to get possibly a little void in the material itself or at the margin. So what you need to do, and what I've learned works great, is to get good with your flowable. Learn how to place it well. And actually what I'll do, after I do my prime and bond, I place a little line of flowable across the whole margin of the prep. And I'll cure that. And that almost guarantees that I'm never going to end up with a void. It's always going to be closed. And the other thing is, because of the C factor, because of the shrinkage of the composite material, if you don't do this, sometimes what happens is you end up with that little white line, like a little frosty line right around the margin. And maybe some of you guys have seen that. You wonder, why do I always get these weird lines right at the interface of the material and the tooth? Well, that's probably because you're getting a little bit of shrinkage and gapping at the margin, which is horrible. So this is a great technique for sealing your margin, having great integrity at the margin, because then it allows you to go back in and layer. So incremental layering, it's pretty much guaranteed. We know that if you're not using high quality composite and you're not layering, 2 millimeters, maybe 3, above that, definitely not going to cure. You're going to get uncured resin, you're going to get inadequate curing of the material. So layer, I kind of take my composite gun, place it in the prep, and kind of almost a Dairy Queen cone or ice cream cone technique where you kind of pull out as you're pushing in and place that material, pack it in, make sure you get your voids covered and fixed, and then go back again, cure it, place it again. Almost always pushing towards the margin too. I have a little burnisher that I use to push the composite back towards the margin up against my layered composite. So these 4 steps, if you do this, you're going to avoid a lot of trouble, headache, learning it the hard way. It took a while to get used to a posterior composite system, and it was one thing that nobody ever told me. It was like, oh, I get this system and it's just going to work. Well, I've never actually seen a video or tutorial going over the tips and hard things that dentists have to learn to actually get it to work in their hands. So hopefully this helps. A couple tips, posterior composites, 4 steps that hopefully help you avoid mistakes and problems. Awesome. Thanks, guys.